Okay, those who have braved the concluding session, thank you. Mao Zedong used to say that a march of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and a long conference ends in the last tiring session. So I'm pleased that we have reached so far without any injuries or missings, and we'll go ahead with this conclusion session, which is the most difficult, for those participating in the session, because everyone prepared a nice, well-organized paper, and they have to make the concluding remarks from what they've picked up during the conference and from the top of their heads. So thank you very much for agreeing to do it. The first, it's my fault, but I don't have any bio notes on anyone, so we all know Rajan, it doesn't have to be introduced, and the two others were asked to introduce themselves. It's fair, isn't it? Anyway, the first concluder is Efrat Elron, please.
Okay, I'm doing it in real time, as Moti said, so I'll use my computer. So just for the introduction, I'm one of those that transferred from the academia to the practitioner world. I used to teach at the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv College. I'm an organizational psychologist by training, so I have a feeling that not many of the other speakers are in this profession. But I got very interested with colleagues of mine from the Hebrew University in how peace operations work organizationally. How is it that 30 militaries together have a more or less unified mission? And ever since I stayed in this sort of intermilitary, intercultural, international arena. And 2.5 years ago, I moved to Rome and was a fellow at the NATO Defense College, a research fellow. And then moved to New York to work with the International Peace Institute, which some of you may know of this institute. It's an institute that works very closely with the United Nations and the capitals and the delegation that surround the UN on multilateral solution to global challenges related to conflict. So it could be anything from terrorism to WMD to peace operations, which is my expertise. And 1 month, then I went on traveling for 6 months. 4 months out of it in the South Pacific. And I just have to tell you, very related to this conference, that as peaceful as the South Pacific seems, there are issues there too, very much in line with what we were discussing. Because, for example, the way that the islanders, as they call themselves, perceive Australia and New Zealand is far from being just a peaceful perception. There is a lot of on the one hand, agreement with the benefits and the assistance that they are getting, and on the other hand, a lot of resentment at the same time, especially on the Fiji side, but also from a country like the Solomon Islands, where they have a regional peace operation taking place in the last few years since the violence erupted there. And just to give you one example of what it is that local populations can find hard, even with just a regional intervention, is that the prices of rents in Honiara, which is the capital of the Solomon Islands, tripled since the internationals came in, because of course they have a lot of money. They are not really limited, or their limitations are much less than those of the Solomon Islanders, and the regular Solomon Islander cannot rent a regular apartment anymore. So this is just one issue out of many of the nuances that sometimes you really have to be in a place to understand what's going on. And I think in this conference we really heard a lot of these nuances, and we also heard a lot of what's going on the international community side. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide my talk into 2 parts. One is just do a very quick summary of what we heard, and the other is propose just possible, not solutions, but methodologies of how we can increase our understandings of what it is that's going on and find concrete solutions to all these dilemmas that we've been discussing for 2 days. And of course, this specific conference is just one of these methodologies that we'll get together and build knowledge from different parts of the world, and then really discuss what's going on here in Israel, here with the Palestinians, and how we possibly can find solutions, but also what are the barriers on the way. So in my fantasy, though, I just have to say that I have this fantasy. You know how all these operating rooms in Israel, it's the ball or the hall or in the Kiryah, in the IDF headquarters. In other militaries, it's these huge, these huge screens that we see on all the walls of where the operational rooms are, or the command and control rooms. And so I imagine this huge screen that has all the factors on one screen. And let's say that you want to change an intervention. Let's say you want to change the intervention in Somalia and increase the number of troops from 10,000 to 13,000. So you put in this data into a computer, and on the screen you'll see all the possible changes that are going to happen locally, regionally, and globally at the same time, and know exactly what to do. If it's a good thing to increase the troop size, or it's not a good thing. But unfortunately, this computer program does not exist yet, so we will suffice with what we have here and the conclusions and other conferences that are taking place all over the world. My understanding from this conference is, of course, the obvious one, that for everything we need a very in-depth understanding if you want to take steps that will really contribute rather than impede. And even with all this in-depth knowledge, we are always bound to have some failures and some successes. It's just the question is not to have, of course, the ultimate success, but how to increase successes and minimize failures. So what is it that we need to have an in-depth understanding of? So first of all, I'll start with the international community actors. So we need to have really an in-depth understanding of national interests. I mean, in every international intervention nowadays, there are many actors that are involved. So we really have to know what are the national interests of these actors. And I think just as one example, Chen talked about it in his, when he talked about Somalia. We heard about this when we talked about Uganda, for example. But what is it that the countries that intervene, what do they want out of these interventions? And it could be anything that is ideological, I mean really global peace, to anything that is very practical and very interest motivated, like let's say the interest in the Pacific region, which are a lot of the time the resources. So the Chinese, for example, love the fisheries and the fish and all the seaworld that is around the Pacific Islands. They have 1 billion people. They have to feed them. Chinese, as you know, like seafood. So there is definitely an interest in why the Chinese give a lot of aid to all the Pacific Islands. So anything in between. So this is really an understanding that we need to have of why international actors do what they do. We need to understand not only the troop contributing countries to the peace operations, but also the donors and why it is that they're giving money to different projects. We definitely need to understand what's going on with the Security Council and the 5 permanent members and what are their interests and motivation and needs. And also, of course, the non-permanent members are very important, or not as important, but also very important. But just everybody, every player has an interest, and one thing that we also may want to know is to find a common ground, if possible, between all these actors. We need to understand their cultures, I mean an in-depth understanding of what their cultures are about. So I'll take one of the issues that was raised, for example, by Benny Miller in the beginning, and this is the perception of morality. I mean, what we see as moral here in Israel or in every other country is very different. And morality in a certain African country is very different than morality in Southeast Asia, and it could be very different than the West, and the Europe and the US differ on these issues, and of course within Europe there are differences. So in that way, each nation has its own ideas of what is moral. This is just one small example of what it is that we need to understand. Not to mention issues like how do you say yes in a country, and how do you say no in a country? Also very important when you talk about these issues. So this is also we need to understand levels of threat, for example, and this was discussed in some of the lectures. I mean, what is the level of threat with a specific country? And again, this relates to the national interests. So what is a certain conflict? What does it present to these countries? I mean, conflicts in the Middle East are different than conflicts in Africa, and they present different levels of threat. When UNIFIL was deployed, the new UNIFIL was deployed after the Lebanon war, there was a big question, and I was always asked that. I mean, who's going to deploy to Lebanon? There is in a Hebrew expression called the Lebanese mud. So who's going to deploy to the Lebanese mud? And my answer was, this conflict is important enough that the countries are going to fight over each other on these deployments. And now we have 30 countries deployed and more countries wanting to deploy. Some have also left. So this issue of threat is very important. Also force protection on the other hand, how dangerous the mission is. What kind of resources the country has? How much do they invest in their defense, in their national defense policy? What is their national defense policy? So these are issues that sometimes we don't even think about when we go into these. We see peace operations as like this homogeneous entity, while essentially it's very heterogeneous, and different contingents really operate in different ways on the ground. And we want to find countries that operate according to the mandate, just as one example. How willing countries are to deal with terror threats? Again, an issue that was discussed here, especially in Afghanistan, but also in relation to Somalia. Are they willing, not willing? Is it important that all countries would be willing to operate as the same country? And again, this is an issue that is very strong in Afghanistan and ISAF, and Evanda talked about some of it at her presentation. Also understanding the UN itself. What are the different bodies? How do they work together? And how do they not work together also? What is the relationship between UNDP and DPKO is crucial for our understanding. What can they bring? Also, what are the reforms that the UN is going through? For example, one important reform that we have to be cognizant of, that the UN is now very much into the partnership agenda. It's something that has been going on especially in the last 2 years. And the partnership agenda, and this goes on to the next topic, is that you don't only partner between the troop contributing countries and the donors, because sometimes those that pay are not those that are deployed. Actually, many times, those that pay for the operation are not those that are deployed, but also really sitting down with the recipient countries and thinking with them, and not only recipients, but also the regional actors. In Africa, for example, it's crucial that the neighbors will be part of this discussion. So this thing is really going on. I mean, these meetings are really taking place at the UN headquarters, where representatives of these countries meet much more often and much more in depth than they used to only 2 or 3 years ago. Also an understanding of how mandates are made. I mean, what are the political stakes that we have, and how to influence it. If you're thinking about a new peace operation, let's say, just imagine a deployment in the Israeli-Palestinian interface. How can countries influence this kind of possible deployment? The local societies, again, and I'm talking now about the recipients. What are their preferences? What are they willing to put up with, and what is it that they are not willing to put up with? So the red lines that they have. What are their cultures? What is it that a peace operation is entering into? And I think the Alpha Bondi, for example, a video is a great example. Actually, does the local population really like Alpha Bondi? I mean, what is he perceived like? Is he really the best representative for the UN? And this is why I was asking about the perceptions. I mean, are there focus groups that analyze before this video is going out if actually he's the one to promote peace, or maybe they actually want some leaders to promote peace, or Kofi Annan to be in this video and sing instead of Alpha Bondi. So this is really, all these issues are nuances, but one video I think it can make a difference for how peace operations are perceived. And how they are perceived, of course, has implications of life and death. I mean, all the attacks that are being done on peacekeepers and on humanitarian workers from Lebanon to Sudan to Somalia. I mean, these are issues that are related to the local populations and what's going on there. So these are, again, what is the civil society like? Can you work with it? To what extent? Who are the reliable actors, the less reliable actors? Having multiple local actors at the same time discussed with, and several of the presentations went to it. What is really failed state? I mean, failed state is a really strong, it's a strong expression. Maybe a weak state is sometimes a better expression to use when, especially when you talk to the country itself. Calling it a failed state sometimes is not really liked by the people of that country. So a weak state or some other expression could be better when we work with these countries. So these are, again, I'm just, and one thing that, one very important thing, and really I think the last session was a great example, the disagreements within a country. I mean, the people here in the last session, Ron and Kobe and Menachem are all for a two-state solution, but even in this two-state solution platform, even there are a lot of disagreements on how to go about it. So there has to be a really in-depth understanding of what are the disagreements and where do they stem from. Other things that were talked about were also and this is a bit of a repetition, but the meaning, definitions, and viability of states. I mean, this really has to be, I think, defined very precisely. What is effective governance? What is economic capability? What is law and order? How to adjust it to the certain country? What are the security conditions with the neighbors? Who are the neighbors, and why? And what security threats they pose? What is a culture of peace? I mean, Kobe talked about it in his talk. I think this is a hugely important issue. I mean, what is peace in the eyes of the local populations, and how do they go about it? And this is not just words. I mean, incitement is a huge thing, and when kids of 5 years old are, and we all know it, when they learn, when they get this incitement at such a young age. I mean, what can we accept from the 16-year-olds and the 20-year-olds and those that we have to negotiate at the end of the day? Vanda talked a lot about dilemmas related to failed states, or just one example, the issue of corruption. I mean, so how is corruption perceived? I mean, how can we deal with it? And I think this is, again, related to most of the talks. It wasn't really mentioned so much in relation to what's going on with the Palestinians, but this is also an issue there that needs to be taken care of, and how far can we go with it? How much of it can we allow it? Another thing that has been raised is the leadership. And this is really an in-depth assessment of what kind of leaders are in a certain state, who can be promoted, who cannot be promoted, who are the spoilers, who can support the cause of peace, and in what ways. So again, I think these issues need to be assessed. Now, and again, I touch only on some of the topics, so I apologize for those that I didn't represent well. In this summary, what can be done? I mean, to get this in-depth knowledge, and some of the things were already mentioned. So, beside the dialogues, for example, dialogues that Ron Pundak mentioned, I want to present some other options. I mean, dialogues between Israeli and Palestinians, which I think are obviously crucial. So one possible project is, for example, looking at the peace operations from all the multiple perspectives at the same time. So, and looking at it in depth through research, So having let's take UNIFOR for example, because this is an existing project that I'm part of. Looking not only at the troop contributing perceptions, but in depth, again, doing research on how the Germans perceive their participation in the maritime force. What do the French think of what is happening there? How do the French perceive Hezbollah? How do the French perceive the Christians in the conflict? How do they perceive their history and how it affects their involvement and so on? The Italians, the Indonesians, all these are part of the project. Then you have the UN itself. So you want to have the DPKO perspective. You want to have the Security Council perspective. You want to have what's going on in the capitals themselves. And of course you want to have the Israeli and Lebanese perspectives. So these two are also presented in the project. So a project like this shouldn't be just a book that is going to be published. This is something that I think needs to be read and understood by those who are going to be deployed, those who are part of the conflict, just to understand more what is going on and what are the stakes. Another kind of project is a project that looks more proactively at the planning of peace operations. So again, I'll go back to one of my favorite possible peace operations or possible international deployments, and let's go back to the Israeli-Palestinian arena. I think it could be a very good idea that instead of creating a peace operation in 34 days, like in the Lebanon war, and all the not always positive consequences of creating a force so quickly, then why not take the time and start thinking about it now? What could be the mandate? I mean, how do the Palestinians see what are the Palestinian needs? What are the Israeli needs from such a possible force? What are the limitations of the troop contributing countries? What is it that they are really willing to give to this kind of force? And sit at one table, not have bilateral or 4 o'clock in the morning faxes like the way that UNIFIL was conceived, but really sit on the same table and for a length of time. And there is, by the way, a project that's already in existence that talks about Jerusalem and the Holy Basin and how that could be, how the international community can intervene there, both, not intervene, but be involved, both in terms of governance, but also in terms of security. So that, for example, involves Canada, the Palestinians, and the Israelis, which form groups of their own, and we can all read about it. They produce something like a 70-page paper that presents all these perspectives and solutions. So come up with not just one model of what's right, but come up with 4 or 5 models that can be presented to decision makers to think in advance what could be the most suitable for this kind of involvement. Another thing is to have the whole idea of intercultural competence training, to give it much more thought and have it be. Here I'm talking also as an organizational psychologist, but also as somebody that has had the chance to talk to a lot of militaries. Most militaries, and this is just an example. I'm not talking even about civilians, but most militaries maybe have half a day or a day learning about how to deal with the specific cultures that they are going into. Most of the times, they don't acquire the skills of the general intercultural competence. What kind of questions do you ask when you come into a new culture? And this is the kind of training that you can give in a day or 2 days and 3 days. And a lot of people that are deployed into conflict areas are lacking this kind of training. So again, even the kind of knowledge that you reproduce here, this kind of knowledge I think could be brought not only here in Tel Aviv University, but representatives from this conference can come into the countries, into the organizations before they deploy and present some of it so they'll have in-depth knowledge. And I think even when people are in the mission, they could still get this kind of knowledge again from the local populations and even people brought from abroad, just to have so they can have this in-depth thinking. So The last thing that I would like to mention is a field that is a growing field now, an emerging field, I would say more or less in the past 5 years. And the organization that I work for, the International Peace Institute, held in 2009 a 2 days conference on this. And this is a field called monitoring and evaluation. And the idea is that you evaluate what's going on with the way that the international community is involved in the recipient country. So, and again, this was mentioned by some of the speakers, all the donor projects. So I'll take this as one example. So you have tens and hundreds and sometimes even thousands of donor projects. It could be projects of education, projects of water projects. It could be agricultural projects. I mean, there are a multitude of areas that the donors are involved in. But what is really lacking is evaluating whether these projects really produce the desired outcomes. And sometimes the desired outcomes are not really known, and the benchmarks are not really thought of before they are deployed, neither by those that are deployed, but also by those that receive those projects. So my recommendation is that this kind of project that I think is best done by a third party. It could be an NGO that specializes in these issues. It could be a private organization. It could be even by a coalition of organizations. So if I take, for example, what is going on, I'll just take the West Bank now. So it could be an Israeli, a Palestinian organization, and an international organization working in collaboration and really assessing what is the impact of these projects. Like one of the issues that a lot of times happen that there are double projects. So there are, for example, a lot of organizations that want to do law and security. Are they coordinated really between them? Like, for example, teaching judges or giving training to judges or giving training to police officers. What's going on there? I mean, there is UPOL, there is the American USCC. So are they really doing the same thing? Are they really, and what are the outcomes of this, let's say of the 10 battalions that are going to, or 12 battalions that are going to, that are happening now or are happening in the West Bank? So just assessing more in depth of what are the outcomes. So if this could be done in a more holistic way, where you assess all the sectors at the same time and also assess the interdependency between the sectors. I mean, how does law and security exactly affect economic development? I mean, vice versa, just as one example. So these are just 4 ways and possible very practical projects that can be done, or projects or endeavors or initiatives that can be done I think, to improve and enforce all these things that we have been discussing. Of course, not ultimate solutions, but just building blocks on how we can improve international involvement in conflict areas.
Thank you very much, Efrat. And now, Frédéric Ansel from Sciences Politiques. That much I know.
Thank you, Chairman, for this very nice presentation. It's too much. Okay, I teach international relations in Sciences Po Paris, yes, and I'm a permanent professor in the École Supérieure de Gestion, IT Management School in Paris, and I try to understand this ideal and marvelous world by a geopolitic way. And I add, with your permission, that I have written the sole book in French about the Golan Heights, because nobody cares about Golan Heights. Me, yes. I really don't know what Mao Zedong said, but I remember very well what the professor Jean-Pierre Filius said yesterday. He He said that it was a strategic mistake to give the microphone during a conference to a French. And I go to prove now that he was very right. Second point, I'm French, and it's not a joke. I'm French patriot, so my English is bad. And there is a second consequence. I'm romantic, and it's not a joke, also because in the international relations, I try to reject the cynical views and the cynical way of thinking. So I'd like to focus my talk on the fundamental questions that turn around our issues. Friedrich Engels said the proof of the pudding is that you can eat it. From Mao to Engels. The proof of the pudding is yes, is that you can eat it. Okay. The best proof of the globalization lies not only in the unprecedented development of global trade or in the global spreading of negationism or plot theory, but in the fact that governments and public opinions are informed quite precisely and almost immediately about all the political, strategic and humanitarian events that take place around the world. It also lies in the capacity several Greek powers, as well as some medias and NGOs, have to project themselves to those regions where a state is collapsing, where criminal wars are acting, where governments are committing slaughters, where people are starving. The end of the Cold War, on one hand, the proliferation of state partitions or creations, on the other hand, have often resulted in situations of this type during the past 20 years. Now, even when the capacity to intervene exists, the will to do so, is not necessarily present, as we saw with the Rwanda genocide in '94. And even when the Greek powers leaders possess both the capacity and the will to intervene, at least three questions are, according to me, to be solved. And we have seen and we have heard it during 2 days. First, moral and philosophical questions. Second, political and commercial ones. And finally, we have to deal with technical and logistic problems. First, who and which criteria? Who can judge the level of gravity of a situation that requires an intervention and determine the red line beyond which the situation can't be tolerated anymore? Which criteria should we take up? The number of civilian victims, the risk of regional conflagration, the threat on war material supplying? Which state will be legitimate to decide that an intervention, especially a military one, is required? The US under George W. Bush in the name of the fight against evil. France and United Kingdom because they used to be colonial powers of first rank. Russia as the descendant of USSR that invaded Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, and so on, non-stop, and now imposed itself in parts of Georgia. China, the power that cares the least about human rights. I think no. I think it's a real question. It's a real problem. Now the problem is if we search for a democratic state that would be free from all imperialism in the past and deprived of all energetic intentions in the present, the populations in danger are bound to wait for a long time before somebody comes to rescue them, a very long time. And finally, when the intervening states or NGOs come to realize that they are being manipulated, what should they do? In Goma, for example, during the terrible summer of '94, the French NGO called Médecins Sans Frontières decided to leave because the aid it provided was completely captured by the former Hutu executives responsible for the genocide. But was it right? Two, is the hard power legitimate? The great question. Since the 90s and the theories of Fukuyama or Nai, the soft power has become a new regulation norm in the field of international relations, at least for many opinion makers around the world. Does it mean that the old traditional hard power has been disqualified once and for good? I think no. The experiences of this decade, from the Restore Hope operation in Somalia to helplessness of the Dutch UN soldiers in Srebrenica, tend to prove that the soft power is not enough to stop the torturers and make them see reason. How should we do in Afghanistan to prevent the Taliban from coming back to re-establish their barbarian rule without the use of force? How can we prevent the exactions committed in Eastern Congo without threatening, at least, to resort effectively to the armed force? 3. The cost to be paid. What human cost Western public opinions are ready to pay in order to save women and children at the other end of the world? In 1939, the people in France and in Great Britain didn't want to die for Danzig. Today, in the West, in the only 2 states disposing of real forces of projection, excepting the US, of course, to what extent are we ready to sacrifice ourselves? In France, under the Jacobin and presidential regime of the Fifth Republic, in which, as you know, the president decides quite alone in the field of foreign affairs, with my respect. The question is not that urgent, because the losses in Chad, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Afghanistan now remain relatively limited. Maybe, okay, it's too much, but it's quite some dozen soldiers killed, if I have a good memory, in the 30 last years. But in the United States, in Great Britain, in Canada, in the Eastern, Central and Eastern Europe, the debates on this issue are more and more vivid. Let's remember the trauma caused in America by the 18 GIs fallen into the attack in Somalia in 1993 during the Restore Hope operation. Let's also remember the Belgian UN troops, exactly paratroopers, in Rwanda, rapidly sent back to their country after the horrible assassination of 10 paratroopers in Kigali on the 7th of April 1994. Or let's think of the attitude of 2 developing and not Western countries, such as Pakistan or India, which seem to be more and more reluctant to send troops under UN flag in dangerous areas, in Eastern Congo in particular. 4. Can we intervene against states marked by a genocide? This question is very, very difficult. From a moral point of view, can we intervene against a state that pretends to be or is actually the heir of a genocide? The question is raised in particular about the Kagame regime in Rwanda, that has been accused by several states of having violated in 96, 98 and more recently the sovereignty of neighboring Congo, of plundering the gold resources of this country, or even of committing war crimes. Anytime the UN tries to criticize the present Tutsi government that actually stopped the genocide in 94, the letter reminds the United States of its total inability to act during the cataclysm. And in Belgium or in the US, the public opinions would be probably against the idea of exerting heavy pressures on the state, on Rwanda. Couldn't we pose the same question about Israel or Armenia? Even if the conditions are clearly different and totally different, those 2 states are, as you know, facing international critics concerning their respective policy in the territories for Israel and in Nagorno-Karabakh for Armenia. 5. Finally, what kind of objective should we assume? The restoration of the state, of democracy, or the return of peace? Fundamental question. For we all know that the 3 elements aren't necessarily linked together. Should we aim at restoring the state, even if it's despotic? Should we strive to establish democracy, even in the absence of a local democratic tradition? Should we be content with the restoration of peace, even if it implies the sacrifice of some elementary liberties? And should we always try to reach the same objective or adapt our policy to each particular case? What is to be done in a country based on tribes and personal customer relationships and not on state-national centralism? What should be done when many adversaries are fighting against each other? Should we stand with the less violent, the most representative, or the most powerful? One will probably be tempted to opt for more flexibility. It seems more relevant to adapt to the particular conditions of each case instead of applying a series of dogmatic principles. But then we are likely to be accused of duplicity, of using a double standard according to some hidden and cynical interests. The fundamental question, the question of the objective of the war, of the main goal of each intervention, offers me a transition with the second part of my speech that will be dedicated to diplomatic and economic issues. First, trade interests. How can we go beyond the economic and trade interests that can obviously link together great powers and world states? For example, how can we convince China to let an international force protect the Darfur region? Okay, today it might be already too late. But the Darfur region or the south of Sudan against the Khartoum's regime headed by the national Islamist Omar al-Bashir, and you know that this man is officially accused of crime against humanity. Indeed, as you know, 30% of the Sudanese, the global Sudanese oil production are kept for China, according to a bilateral and legal treaties between the two sovereign countries. During the 80s and the 90s in Angola, destroyed by a long and cruel civil war, the absence of peace intervention from the outside, excepted Cuba's one, sure, and South Africa's one, sure, was probably due to the preservation of trade interests related to the production of diamonds and oil. Since the 50s, at least, the Greek powers attribute themselves the right and find the means, all the means, to intervene efficiently to the Persian Gulf, by far and for sure the most important oil production area in the world, whenever it's needed, whereas they intervene very weakly after the disaster of Haiti in an area much less significant from an economic point of view. 2, historical and cultural affinities. How can we go beyond the cultural affinities between some Greek powers and some world states? During the conflict in ex-Yugoslavia, Russia evidently supported Serbia, an Orthodox and Slavic republic, against Croatian Catholics and Bosnian Muslims. In 1999, we had to resort to NATO bombings to convince Mr. President Milosevic to stop his aggressive policy in Kosovo, since Moscow has certainly vetoed any such action in the Security Council. Other case, the Arab League reject the idea that a Western force could intervene in the Arab space, especially in Yemen or in Sudan. True, the League accepted the Desert Storm operation in 1991, but according to me, it's a counterexample because Saddam Hussein has crossed the red line in invading a brother state and threatening Saudi Arabia. In spring 1998 in Sri Lanka, when the Tamil rebellion was crushed by the Singali government, India, which shelters a significant Singali population in the south of the country, had warned that it would oppose any foreign intervention, even for a humanitarian type. Even more critical, a number of Pakistanis belong to the ethnic group of the Pashtuns, the same group that produced the poorly famous Taliban. This perhaps, I say perhaps, I'm not a specialist of the Pakistan, perhaps contributes to explain the constant double game played by Islamabad in the so-called tribal areas in the northwest of the country where Al-Qaeda is hiding, but where a majority of Pashtuns are living. How should we deal with this problem? 3. The political nature of the interveners. Since the 90s, multilateralism has become the new international norm. When George W. Bush overlooks the United Nations and attacks Iraq in 2003, he is condemned for unilateralism. Even if 43 countries, I say 43 countries, take part in the coalition. That is to say, more than 1/5 of all the existing countries in the world. And by the way, most of them were authentic democracies. Let's take the principle of multilateralism. So long, so good, okay. But what are the United Nations? And the question was posed immediately at the beginning of our conference. Isn't it a relatively classical meeting of states, a sort of Westphalian system of states governed by the traditional balance of power between them, in particular between the 5 Greek powers, including some others from time to time? When France launched the Turquoise operation in Rwanda and the Licorne operation in Côte d'Ivoire, Paris did ask officially for the authorization for the United Nations, but it was rather formal in fact. After the invasion of Iraq, the UN recognized the new regime, a more or less democratic one, that was established in the country. However, we still consider that the new Iraqi regime lacks legitimacy because it seems to be subjected to the United States. Besides, should we not encourage the intervention of the neighboring countries? Think of the Arab states. Why couldn't they deal with the collapsed state or the rogue states belonging to their own political and cultural world? Why couldn't the sub-Saharan African states do the same in their own area? Why wouldn't Central Asia be responsible for the complex fate of Afghanistan? In reality, this perspective seems not very realistic and rather naive in the short and medium term. Not only do the rivalries between states remain extremely vivid within those 3 unstable worlds, but the states generally don't possess the capacity required to restore peace and the state of law by force. The case of the All-African Intervention Force in Darfur is a clear demonstration of this powerlessness. Several thousand troops for 5 countries were deployed until 2008 in a quiet, hostile ground of 500,000 kilometers square, without enough materials, without enough training, and without enough organization, except maybe in the case of the Rwandan soldiers. This concrete experience leads me to my 3rd and last section dedicated to technical and logistic problems. First, geography. My master in geopolitics, the French professor Yves Lacoste, often says that geography is first and foremost the servant of war. In any case, the interventions into collapsed states often take place in complex climatic and topographic areas, especially for Western soldiers used to act in plains and in a moderate climate. As for the cities in which they have to trek, they are more often than not in a poor state that favors urban area. The consequence of this state of affairs is that the cost of the equipments and training that must be acquired and organized before intervening is very, very high. This is even more true when the routes leading to the operation field are under the control of fragile or despotic governments. To ensure, for example, the supplying of NATO soldiers in Afghanistan, we must rely to the cooperation not only of Russia and Pakistan, but of 2 republics of the ancient Soviet bloc, including the unstable Kyrgyzstan. Two, the priorities, in the reconstruction process. What is to be restored primarily after an intervention in a collapsed state? Water and electricity, the school system, roads and bridges, polling booth, the government seat, cousins maybe, or religious buildings, casinos. The choice is a question. The choice isn't without consequences. In all devastated regions, if we don't deal seriously with social problems, as we heard often during 2 days, political and religious extremists will impose themselves, always, in any case. This question is not only technical, the answer reveals and determines the spirit in which the operation is conducted. 3. How do we spend money? Even the huge budgets allocated to Afghanistan by the powerful America and powerful and the rich Europe and Japan were not enough to stabilize the social situation in Afghanistan. Should we think that the quantity of money wasn't sufficient? More probably, it was not spent as it should have been. How can we control efficiently the financing of humanitarian programs? What was the utility of the money Americans, Europeans, Japanese poured into the Palestinian Authority under the former president of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat? It had a real utility. It allowed PLO executives to grow richer. What are the good ways for a rational investment and a fair redistribution? Everybody is not like the honest Salam Fayyad. In some cases, it's possible to leave the management of resources to the locals, protecting only the ways of extraction and transport. This solution makes possible genuine national development. The example of the Iraqi Kurdistan of yesterday, the Kurdistan protected by the American Air Force as soon as 91 is very, very interesting. But all the populations in danger in the world don't possess such a generous soil to exploit. 4, the communication. Finally, it's so necessary to communicate on each peacekeeping or state-building operation. People laughed, really laughed. I remember very well of this period and of this episode. People laughed at the U.S. when it decided to open a humanitarian corridor in Somalia. France didn't manage to convince the other states of the relevance of its Licorne operation in Côte d'Ivoire, and it was even worse in the case of the Turquoise operation in Rwanda in '94. The European Union better communicated when it sent troops to Kivu and Ituri provinces in the Congo, in the eastern Congo. But the lack of critics of our reactions is most probably due to the fact that almost nobody is interesting. Oh, I have 20 minutes more. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, 5. So I go fast and quickly. The lack of critics of reactions about this operation, the European operation, is most probably due to the fact that almost nobody is interested in the fate of this region, where millions, I say millions of civilians, I say civilians, not soldiers, have been killed during only 15 years. In comparison with the philosophical and diplomatic question we dealt with at the beginning of my talk, these questions of logistics and communication may appear to be secondary. But we should not underestimate them. The worst thing that can happen to an intervention force is to fail to impose itself both in the battlefield and in the minds. In every intervention, the credibility of the United States and the Greek powers is at stake. It can be affected, including by minor and perfectly trivial problem, and in the life of the local population. To conclude, I'd like to give you a very modest contribution. I like to sum up, but I want to create maybe a new debate. It's always easier to ask questions than to answer them. So I did not mean to avoid this risky exercise. That's the reason why I will conclude with 3 short and global propositions. The nation state that developed in the West during the 19th century and that appears today as the dominant political form in the world is not eternal. Nothing is eternal. And it proved to be fallible. But, what do we propose to replace it? A corrupted and religiously fanatic tribalism? Who are warred completely out of any law in their respective kingdoms, population taken as hostage by various groups of militants, each one more criminal than the other in Greece areas? I'm not really sure. So, nature fears emptiness. So does geopolitics. If the democratic powers remains to take their responsibilities in world affairs, others will take their place. China's penetration in Africa is a striking example of this rule. And even if Westerners aren't angels, I know that we aren't angels, I consider their influence as still preferable than Russia's or China's, at least for the time being. Because the Western influence is sometimes led by humanistic values, sometimes. I think we should go on assuming, my last sentence, on responsibility of peacekeeping and state-building operation. Without ideology, when we reach an extremity, with no alternative, with modesty and so, etc. But we have to go. Third, and I finish with these words, finally, I think we don't need to be cynical, as I told you, in international relations. I acknowledge the primacy of power relations and well-understood interests, and I accept the formula coined by Friedrich Nietzsche, who described the state as a cold monster. I see all that, but I'm not content with people's unhappiness. To the biblical question, am I my brother's keeper? I think we must absolutely answer yes, even in a rational and not a utopian way. And we must try, I say try, to help this brother. Were we to give up this principle, we will simply stop to be ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederic. But you've got another 15 minutes. What should we do? Well, last but not least, Rajan Menon, who was one of those who opened the conference, and we have got the honor that he also concludes it.
Frederic described himself as a romantic, and now you get the cynic. I often wonder why I'm asked to speak at these conferences on peacekeeping, because I am skeptical, not that I don't think it's a good idea. Mahatma Gandhi was once asked in the middle of the Indian freedom struggle, what do you think about Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a good idea. So my same sentiments about peacekeeping. I want to try to conceptualize, I didn't think it was that funny. I want to conceptualize the categories of peacekeeping that we have covered here so that we can discuss them. And just bear with me for a moment, because I am technologically illiterate. In my last book, I needed a table drawn, and I asked my 10-year-old daughter to help me. That's how bad off I am. But let's imagine an imaginary continuum, starting here and moving here. From here, basic, and here, more difficult. So I'm talking now about peacekeeping, intervention, those kinds of things. So start with the easy part, at this end of the continuum. You have bilateral mediation, whether by a state, an organization, or someone who's a special representative of the UN Secretary General. And there have been many such mediations in disputes between and among states and disputes within states. It happens all the time, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Let's move 1 millimeter, centimeter, whatever, over to this side, getting somewhat more difficult. Excuse me. You have peacekeeping that interposes troops among or between states that have recently had a war to prevent that war from breaking out, to allow diplomacy to take place. This happens many times. The main stumbling block, of course, is that you have to clear it with the United Nations Security Council. Let's move one more to the more difficult side. Peacekeeping within states, which we've also talked about. It can happen under UN auspices, as in Darfur and Somalia, although I realize that Darfur was a hybrid, or it can happen in a regional form. We've had wonderful presentations on Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, and Darfur that have shown us this. And all the way at the other end, which is something that I began with in my first set of remarks to you, two types of interventions that are much more problematic. Humanitarian intervention that presumes that the regime in question is the root cause of the problem, that the violence inheres in the nature of the regime, and the regime must be removed, or reasons of state intervention, such as the United States invoked in regime change in Afghanistan and Iraq. In neither case was humanitarianism particularly important. After all, we not only tolerated the Taliban for many years before 9/11, we were even prepared to work with them, although we were now content to think otherwise. Now, that's the continuum. Let's look at some of these things. So I want to turn to Jen for a moment. I'm glad he's here. There's no point attacking someone if he's not here. I'm not going to attack you. You mentioned yesterday that, contrary to what some people think, sovereign states don't impede peacekeeping. Now, I don't know who said it, but it certainly wasn't me. It is obviously true that sovereign states allow peacekeeping because the UN has something like 15, 16, you probably know the number, 16, okay? I'm going to make a lot of numerical mistakes, so please jump in, all over the world. But here are some facts that have to do with the limitations that sovereign states place on these missions. The UN Peacekeeping Department's budget, according to its latest website tally, is about $6 billion. If you total up the budget of the New York City, that is the city I live in, the New York City Police Department and the New York City Fire Department, you come to about $4 billion. We want, in a world of, how many states are there? 200 something? Oh, you're so good with this. 192 states. We want, in a world of 192 states, which are failing in some cases, ethnic conflict, the murder of children, the rape of women, we want an organization to put out the fires, and we give it a budget of $5 to $6 billion. All right, 7.8. Let's say it's 10 billion, right? How serious are we? As every Secretary General since the very first one has said, the UN can be no better than its members want it to be. Who are the members? Well, they happen to be the sovereign state. A second problem. I understand the reason for this, but you cannot implement even these easy kinds of operations without the consent of the Security Council. And there are many missions that have been vetoed on this basis. But the problem gets worse. When you have these missions, very often what you have is what I'll call the gaggle problem, right? A gaggle of geese, a flock of geese. You have a large number of countries participating. Some of these countries, one would like to think, are involved for humanitarian reasons, norms, universal values, all these things that constructivists love to talk about. But the fact of the matter is that some states do it for cold cash. Some of them are good at it. Others are so bad at it that not only can they not keep the peace, they are raping the very women that they were sent to protect in the first instance. Okay? But the problem is much worse than that. These troops from sometimes 15 or 16 countries are brought together in one location without ever having trained together, without having a common operational command, without any common training in the art of peacekeeping, and often are lightly armed, and the results are often predictable. Sometimes people say, look at the number of states participating. Isn't this wonderful? It shows great commitment on the part of humanity. The way I look at it is varying training, limited numbers, little to no experience of working together, and generally too few in number, i.e., a recipe for, if not failure, then certainly for anemia and ultimate withdrawal. Now let's look at something more difficult, which is peacekeeping within states. We have had several presentations, all of them excellent. An excellent one by Jen on Somalia, one on Darfur, and one on Uganda. So what does this tell us? Let's take Somalia. Now, here, sovereignty was not a barrier. I think, Jen, you pointed out, well, what is it called? The African Union, before that, the OAU, was happy about this. Shows that sovereign states like this kind of thing. It really doesn't show anything of the sort, unfortunately. What it shows is that there was a state that was collapsing. The OAU and the AU have in its charter one thing: enshrining the sovereignty of states. Why African states, as Modi has pointed out, often are patched together with differing ethnicities and different tribal groups, partly because, and here I disagree with them, of the enlightened imperial rulers that you think should now be in charge of them or something. Nevertheless, the issue was that the AU and the OAU and the AU, depending on the time you're looking at, agreed to this because sovereignty and peacekeeping in this instance were completely in harmony. But even then, look at some of the statistics that you yourself gave us. So the mission began, I believe, with 500 Pakistani peacekeepers. Now, I ask you this. Somalia is a fragmenting society. Puntland, this land, that other land. 500 Pakistani peacekeepers? I wouldn't feel secure in my neighborhood in New York if there were 500 Pakistani peacekeepers. Then there's another mission, 30,000, of which 20,000 are guests from where? The good old US of A. Well, this is not sustainable because I'm here to tell you that in my country there isn't support to do this anymore. We don't have the money, we don't have the stomach for it, and we're tired of being the whipping boy of the rest of the world. We can't do it. And then there were 14 other states, 9 of whom provided less than 1,000, some in the double digits. What kind of contribution is this? So this pattern is not very good. Then comes something called UNOSOM 2. India and Pakistan, 5,000 troops apiece. Now, talk of two countries who haven't trained together. They've been fighting each other. So they're now in a peace operation, yeah? 6 other states between 2,700 and 1,300. And 18 other states below that. Huge numbers, relatively few states. This is not a way to go about it. It gets worse, however. In 1995, the United States, that great paragon of democracy, says it wants to leave. The UN operation collapses, and what do? Right? We turn to Ethiopia, that great example of democracy in Africa, to go after the Shabab in Somalia. Right? Now, what is the conclusion? By your own terms, Jen. I'm paraphrasing you. In Somalia, the UN did not back its talk with action. No kidding. Another quote. It showed that it had no influence in the conflict in central and southern Somalia. Now, that has to be the understatement of the century. So there's one example of peacekeeping. Now, Benny Neuberger, who is an excellent specialist on Africa, as is Moti, made the following observation, that Somalia was such a bad experience for the United States that therefore it did not intervene in Rwanda. Now, there is no way the United States would have intervened in Rwanda. Shame on the entire world for letting 800,000 people die. When General Romeo Dallaire said to Kofi Annan, who later he was rewarded for this by being made Secretary General, he said, give me 3,000 more troops, because the Interahamwe, these thugs who were going around killing people with machetes, at the first sign of a well-trained army, they would melt into thin air. Now, Dallaire didn't get the troops, and you all know his sad history. He had a nervous breakdown, suffered depression. Read his book, Shaking Hands with the Devil, and it's a sobering commentary on peacekeeping. But the U.S., Somalia or not, would certainly not have intervened, I can assure you. So we now move to Darfur. So there is the first African Union peacekeeping operation. This gets from the sublime to the ridiculous. 450 troops from 10 African states. 10 selected by the government of Sudan. 450 troops from 10 African states selected by the government of Sudan because the Chinese are prepared to back them to the hilt because they're in bed with Omar al-Bashir. Right? Now, what is the mission? Again, defined by the government of Sudan. To monitor the situation. Right? What does that mean? Women are being raped and children are being killed. What does monitoring mean? You're watching it and taking notes and reporting that you've seen this? I mean, if that isn't an obscenity, what?
Some examples that I know
Yeah.
that actually work.
Yeah, it doesn't work, unfortunately, sir, for the people who are getting killed and raped, right? I mean, that's that.
Please, don't intervene.
It doesn't.
Please, no intervention from the crowd.
No, it's okay, Mati. It doesn't work for the people who are being killed and raped. It may work after the fact, but it doesn't save people as the mission was supposed to do. They were only to fire in self-defense. This in the context of the Civil War. They were only to fire in self-defense. How can you deter extremely pitiless, bloodthirsty individuals on both sides? And it gets even worse. In an area the size of France, they're responsible for 6 million IDPs. Right? How are they to get to places even to report? Okay, even to report. One of my students, Ahmed Salim, his father was Salim Salim, probably Africa's most distinguished diplomat after Kofi Annan, and would at one point have become UN Secretary General, said to me when he came to visit my university, because he was the AU's representative to Darfur. He said, we needed helicopters. Why? Too few troops, big country. They needed to get somewhere. Nobody would ante up to provide 64 helicopters. Universal norms? I mean, really. Maybe this works in Columbia University or Harvard or the University of Minnesota where they're publishing books about norms, but this is not the real world, I can assure you. Then there's the joint force called UNAMID, I believe. The target is about 26,000 troops. The actual number of real combat troops is 16,000, again, a country the size of France. The military people call this a force-to-space ratio problem. It's a pretty severe one in this instance, right? The ICC indicts Omar al-Bashir. What happens? He kicks out the aid workers. He is warmly welcomed when he goes to the AU summit. And what is he doing now? He's trying to use cooperation on the Southern Sudan referendum, use that as leverage for trying to get the indictment lifted. He may not succeed, he may succeed, right? Now, so what was Edith Black's conclusion? That in Darfur, peacekeeping was unable to stop the murder, rape, etc., I'm paraphrasing her, she said it much more nicely, in one of the world's great humanitarian crises. Right? Now, again, Benny observed that the real problem here was that the United States didn't intervene. Because why? We had brokered some agreement in the southern Sudan between Bashir's regime and the SPLA. But I can assure you that my government acted in a totally cowardly fashion. Our diplomats were prevented from using the word genocide. Because if we used it under the Genocide Convention, we would have been obligated to do something. They said, well, incident. Someone asked, is genocide going on? Well, that's a matter of perception. Matter of perception? According to Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, the intent to destroy in whole or part a people, I think it qualifies. Then we had Uganda, not a peacekeeping operation, but here's what Sandrine told us, and I thought a marvelous presentation, right? Operation Iron Fist began in 2002. By 2004, Museveni's counterinsurgency had created 1.8 million IDPs. But he succeeds through labeling, discourse, sending diplomats with charts and graphs in not even having the UN seriously discuss this, despite the efforts of people like Egeland, forget a peacekeeping operation. And, of course, because the United States now is consumed with the global war on terror, we may now next invade maybe Somalia and Yemen because of cargo plane problems, having made short work of Afghanistan and Iraq. There was no peacekeeping operation. So the bottom line is that there have been some terrific successes. Now, I owe a sort of explanation to Christoph Bender, who said, look, wasn't Bosnia a success? And I have to say to him, yes, you made an excellent point. I think Bosnia, the peacekeeping operation, took Bosnia from the gates of hell, not to heaven, to a much better place. Would I, as a Bosnian, prefer to live in the 1992-95 world or the present world? Of course. It was a success, and I think you made actually a very good point, and your point is well taken. The problem, of course, is that it is the exception that proves the rule. In other words, the scale of that operation, the time invested, the money invested is such that that is not a model that I think is pragmatic, given the problems that I've described, to apply across the board. Macedonia, again, you gave a terrific presentation, and that was a wonderful example again. And I asked you jokingly, the Macedonians must be the most reasonable people in the world, because tremendous compromises were made by the majority group. That doesn't happen very often. Now, let me turn to the last. How am I doing on time, Moti? How much do I have?
You're okay.
Okay. I'm okay as in?
Another 30 minutes.
Another 30 minutes, yeah, okay. I want to turn to humanitarian intervention and reasons of state intervention. Sorry, I'm tired and not able to think straight, so if I mess up with no more numbers, so you don't have to worry about me. I'm doing fine, okay. Here's the difficulty, and I think Frederic touched on some of these things. We still have no uniform standard, legal or moral, which guide us to know when to act. That means we will act selectively. Now, that's not a bad thing. Just because we can't solve every case of genocide or violence, it's okay if we save some. But let's not pretend that we have some uniform standard, that norms are on the march, and now we're much more enlightened people. We do this pragmatically. I'm fine with that as a realist. I don't have any problem with that. We have no standard because it's certainly not the number of deaths, which it ought to be. For instance, were Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is the people who were being killed there, any less deserving than the Bosnians and the Kosovars, if this criterion is used? Hard to argue. There's the selectivity problem. There are states in the world today that are powerful enough to carry out significant atrocities and never face even a serious Security Council intervention. This humanitarian action will be aimed at states that are poor and are weak. That too is okay, but let's not please preach about uniform standards. There's the precedent problem. I think that given what the Serbs had done in Kosovo, something needed to be done. But let's not forget what the result of the NATO operation was. It was the truncation of a sovereign member of the United Nations. I'm no fan of the Serbian regime. Well, I like it better now than I did earlier. But that is the result. Now, immediately the Russians, who will act regardless of whether this happened or not, said, we have a right to protect and defend South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the two statelets that had helped hive off from Georgia, partly because the Georgians, in their hyper-nationalist fantasies, drove minority populations out. We have the right to do this. There is a precedent that's been set. So, finally, reasons of state intervention. I think and I hope we have reached the high water mark of these kinds of interventions, a la Afghanistan and Iraq. Iraq was indefensible based on American national interest in terms of the suffering and the deaths it has created. And those who are celebrating now the decline of violence may rue the day, because I think that the last chapter in Iraq hasn't been written yet. It is a country that could still fragment, and then we'll be in for a lot of trouble. Not only that, which state in the Middle East is happiest with the government that now rules Iraq? It's Iran. So the United States, which under Reagan called Iran the great Satan, has done it the great favor of invading a country, killing tens of thousands of Iraqis, killing lots of young Americans, and putting in power a group that the Iranians are quite happy with. Not that the Iranians can control them, right? But they basically are happy, much happier than they were with Saddam. Afghanistan, many problems. I think Wanda told you about them. But this model for fighting the global war on terror is ludicrous, because Al-Qaeda, like groups, are mobile. They move through circuits of globalization. They have global franchises. They recruit. They use the internet. They land in states which are conducive to their operations. Are we to invade state after state in these kinds of operations? We don't have the manpower. We don't have the money, having spent $1.1 trillion, kill lots of our own, kill more of others. And we certainly will not have the support of NATO, and we certainly will not have the support of the international community. But on top of that, and this is my main objection, it is a stupid way to go about fighting this war. I think you take the lesson from Israel. Terrorism is an evil thing. You use as much security against it as possible. You try to get at the roots of the problem. Here I would argue that Israel hasn't done enough to get at the roots of the problem, but I'll come to that in a second. And you tell your people that you will try to minimize terrorism, but terrorism cannot be eradicated 100%, and it cannot be fought like a conventional enemy. This business of arguing that every failed state becomes a condominium in which Al-Qaeda decides to move in, and therefore you want to intervene, is really bad. Now, I'm going to do something that I wasn't going to do, which is really to turn to Israel, because I found the last panel both quite energizing and, in fact, touching. I'm always touched by this when I come to this country. And that is that you have a debate that is richer and more honest and more fundamental than we have in the United States. I can't speak for Europe. Because the kind of debate we had here, Moti, in these two sessions, simply could not be had in my country. We're not honest about the problems. It is a highly partisan, polarized debate. You pointed out that there are no devils and angels, a dichotomy. Well, we have a devil and angels thing, and Kobe, you said that you worry that in the world the Palestinian narrative of things is gaining traction. I can assure you that in the United States that's not the case. It is the hard right narrative of Israel, or the narrative of the Israeli hard right. I recognize there are many different positions in this country that holds sway. It is definitely not the position that Ron Pundak or Menachem or Dr. Abu Zaid presented. It's absolutely not. Now, I'd like to turn to your presentation for a moment, because I have deep respect for you, but I do want to say the following. You outlined a series of requirements for Israel's for a positive peace. And let me make my own credentials clear. I am 100% opposed to idiotic things like boycotting Israeli academics or Israeli universities. I am opposed to it as a friend of this country. I'm opposed to it as an intellectual. Whenever there's an attempt to do this, I sign a petition against it. I also don't think that solutions like the one-state solution are feasible or possible. That requires Israel's self-liquidation. Nobody can expect Israel to self-liquidate. I also don't believe that the right of return is feasible, no matter what you may think of what happened in the 1948 war. You can be on the side of Benny Morris, against Benny Morris. It's just not feasible. But to compile a desiderata of extraordinarily stringent requirements, including that somehow Israel should flourish for a positive peace. I mean, Israel is flourishing.
Israel should flourish because of what Israelis do. And what I found interesting in your presentation, on the one hand, you're a person from a security and military background, but when I come to Israel, I see a more confident, vibrant, democratic, developed democracy, high-tech, one of the best, I would argue, the best army in the world. But this was a presentation that almost looked like crouching and fear and vulnerability, that the Palestinians should recognize Israel. Israel is in the Middle East to stay. It is not going anywhere. Now the question is, if one wants things like a non-failing Palestinian state and so on, the question one has to ask oneself is, has the stronger party done all that it can? Is the expansion of settlements during the negotiations a good way to create good faith? Imagine if the shoe were on the other foot and the Palestinians were the ones creating settlements. I think it sends a pernicious message. Is this idea that's gained traction, and I know many Israelis are opposed to it, of a loyalty oath, is that a good way to win the confidence of the Arab Israeli population? Isn't it important to convince Palestinians that if they cease things that are mortal threats to Israel, that kill innocent Israelis, that they have a future, and that Israel is a powerful state in the ways that Pundak mentioned, training doctors, helping children, helping build institutions, the Palestinians have the great blessing. One day, they will have a state, I think, where they'll be singularly lucky. They won't have as their neighbor, their immediate neighbor, some state like Syria, which is a decrepit dictatorship, or Iraq, which is sort of chaotic, or Mubarak's pharaonic regime. They will have a vibrant, highly civilized, wealthy state that can do so much to empower it and prevent it from being a failed state. So we must ask the question, has that been done? And honestly, I must tell you, as a friend of this country, I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not sure on which side of the debate I stand. I stand much more on the Pundak men. I don't agree with everything that they've said, but it seems to me that there's a responsibility and confidence that should come with what Israel has achieved. Every time I land at the airport here, I look down and I think to myself, in 1948, this was a desert. Look at what they've built here against enormous odds. On the one hand, that should make them not want to lose it. On the other hand, I think it's time to come out of this sort of defensive, crouching approach and say, we can make the peace in a different kind of way. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, on the whole, the conclusion hasn't been more optimistic than the different sessions. I think it was Durkheim who said that the trouble with universal values is that you don't have a universal community to sustain it. First of all, not everybody in the globe subscribe to universal values, and unfortunately, those who do subscribe act rather on narrow national selfish motives, and the results are seen all over the world. There's one though, I think, a group of people who have transcended this narrowness of nationalism, and they are among our fellow academics who hate nationalism and declare themselves to be the citizens of the world. And nobody touched on their position towards the atrocities and sufferings of people across the world. And I have not seen them mobilized in order to boycott Sudan or to boycott South Africa for helping liquidating the Zimbabwe state and nation, or standing up in defense of the raped women in the Republic of Congo. But they mobilized almost to a man, except for a few, in boycotting Israel. And I think many of the miserable people I have mentioned would have loved to be Palestinians. So here we are. So where will the hope come from? Anyway, it's open to the public. Yes, please. Yes? Yes, it's you.
Okay. First of all, about the oath of allegiance, and I have to correct you. As unnecessary, as stupid as this measure is, it will not apply to the Arabs of Israel, which makes it even more unnecessary and one more tone and nationalistic cacophonia that envelops us. But that's about that. I want to understand one thing. What is the difference?
Just to be clear, I didn't say it applied to the Arabs.
Yeah. But so this ongoing plain discourse that it applies to the Arabs, and of course nobody. It applies to my mother-in-law, by the way. She would have to do that, but she's 77 years old. And that's as stupid as it is. She wouldn't really mind, by the way. But I want to understand one other thing. I think that this question is relevant to Frédéric Ancel and to you, Dr. Manon. What is the difference between military intervention and military invasion? And what is, on principle, in the eyes of international community or whatever, the basic difference, and let's not speak about politics and ideology, between Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Iraq in 2003? What's the difference here?
It's the same. Kobe?
Thank you. I'd like to make two comments. The first one is regarding the challenges of operations. I think that the idea of financing the operations is the less problematic issue. I think that we are facing three main challenges. First of all, the political will, which is the other coin of the hypocrisy of the international community. Actually, you have touched the point, but if the international community would have devoted one-tenth of the energy and the resources that are devoted in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, okay, in Africa would have been in a better situation. Okay? If the international community would have devoted, talking about money and the resources, 1/3, okay, of the resources that were devoted in the Palestinian territories since 1993, okay, the world would have been looked much better. Because I don't know if people have an idea. The Palestinians, okay, the Palestinian authorities since 1993, okay, have got from the international community twice per capita than Japan and Germany together after World War II. Okay, twice per capita. And I think that the international community should ask itself what actually has happened. Just a moment. Secondly, I think that the other problem that we are facing regarding peacekeeping operation is the tension between the need to stabilize the arenas and the need to reconstruct it or to rebuild it from the societal or the economic or the political point of view. In order to stabilize the arenas, in order to minimize the level of the violence, you need to have a very professional military forces. Those professional military forces are mainly from Western countries. Western countries are not willing to contribute these troops in order to stabilize these arenas. Okay? There is no local support, there is no domestic support in these Western countries, there is no political will among these governments, and when there is a political will and there are troops from Western countries, from professional militaries, there is a tension between the professional ethos of the professional soldier and the ethos of the peacekeeper. Okay? And this tension is not released yet. And the third problem in this regard is the idea of the social engineering, which eventually is the bottom line of each peacekeeping operation or state building operation, because all the idea is a political idea, and all the idea is the idea of reconstructing or reshaping the political structure, the societal structure of the conflict arena, and I'm not sure that there is enough knowledge, understanding, and the political will to do such a thing. And eventually we are dealing with going back to the triangle that I have presented before, we are dealing mainly with the physical violence, we are not dealing with the structural and the cultural violence. Okay? This is the first comment, sorry that it was a bit long. Regarding your comments about my presentation, I think that the last thing that you can say in this regard, that it comes from fear or something like that. I was talking about the basic vision, okay, in the Israeli perspective regarding the nation state of the Jewish people as a secured and flourishing state in the region. Doesn't mean that this state is not a flourishing state, and it doesn't mean that this state is not a secure state. Okay? It means that this is the vision, or this is the Israeli perspective, the Israeli perspective in this regard. This is the strategic goal, okay? And we have, when we have to deal with the Palestinian issue and Israeli-Palestinian agreement, okay, we have to take into consideration what are the potential risks or what are the potential strategic threats in this regard. Now, Israel cannot afford itself as a state, at least following my understanding, my strategic understanding, okay, to take risks that might be derived from a negative peace with the Palestinians. Because those kind of risks actually will threat seriously and strategically the Israeli vision regarding the nation state. Because if any future agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians will look like the situation that we have in the Gaza Strip after the withdrawal of 2005, okay, this is a serious strategic threat for the state of Israel, and Israel cannot afford it. And in order to ensure that such a thing will not be there, we need a positive peace. And for that we need a very long process, and there are things that the state of Israel should do in this regard in order to enable such a process. Okay? But a positive peace is a strategic.
Thank you. Thank you, Kobi. Charles? No, I said Charles.
First of all, a short remark about the debate between the troops contributing countries within UN missions and the countries that pay for missions, the Western countries and developing countries sending troops, Pakistani, Indian troops, and so on. A few months after leaving the United Nations, Jean-Marc Guéhenno, the last Secretary General for peacekeeping, explained in a conference in London that in a certain way we were quite happy with this situation, having India and Pakistan sending troops, and that in a certain extent it had become a sign of, since it had become a sign of countries that were developed versus countries that were underdeveloped. When these so-called underdeveloped countries were going to look at themselves as no more underdeveloped countries but developed countries, like you can take the example of India, for example. And at a certain point they were going to say, well, now is the moment that we won't send any more troops, we want to pay as you are paying too, because we don't want to be looked at as underdeveloped countries. Then we're going to have a strong problem because in a certain way Western countries are going to be obliged to send troops in these UN missions, or to negotiate with countries that might not be so willing as they were in the past to send troops to be trained and to be paid by the United Nations because they were benefiting from this situation. And second point, maybe on the question of values and ideologies, and I think maybe and it's a subject that we've talked about at several times in the 3 days of conference. Maybe for 20 years we've been discussing about the end of history and the end of ideologies and the end of values, and we still today have students in courses reading Francis Fukuyama text again and again and again, and asking themselves, are we ideologies? No, ideologies, etc. And maybe these universal values, we ask ourselves is if these values were humanitarian values, for example, were universal values or culturally marked values, etc. And I think, I believe more and more that yes, maybe we can assume the fact that maybe these values are looked at as ideological. And maybe it's a good thing to have this kind of ideology, but maybe in the sense of what you said regarding the support countries can put into, for example, UN missions on the ground, for example, in financial aspects. Maybe we just have to assume that these values are only ideologies, values of protecting civilians on the ground, values of trying to prevent some violent conflicts, and some success and sometimes with not so many successes. But that's just the point I wanted to make on this issue of ideology. Thank you.
Okay, this morning, Moti said she feels like watching Hamlet and the Princess there. And I have the same...
Do you see him now?
Yes, but I'm looking for a different prince right now. Because, and this refers a little bit to all presentations, but maybe most to the first, where I really tried to have a vision about do things better. And I think there were many important things that they are done. But what was missing for me was, I think it is impossible to improve the efficiency of peace operations without more knowledge and significantly more knowledge about the population that should be saved by those interventions. I mean, in the literature, even in the book of Dallaire, which Ajahn mentioned, in the memoirs of the people, you will find enormous examples for the unpreparedness and the ignorance of the people who are getting into those situations. And I think, by the way, this is one reason why sometimes private military companies are better in doing the job, because they understand that intelligence is the key to an effective operation. So to me, there was a lot. Everything that was said was about how can we more effectively organize things. But this other side, this side, how can we better understand the people that we pretend to save here? This was missing for me. And there is one thing that related to this, to which I have to comment. And this, because I think it is a huge misconception. I don't know who said that the people are waiting for us to come. The topic of my PhD dissertation was about normalization processes in civil wars. And the case study was the Angolan War, and I once was very excited and nervous when I was invited to present the dissertation to Angolan researchers. And the biggest compliment I got from one social scientist, a senior researcher, was said to me, the merit of your work is that you try to show that people are not sitting around and waiting to be killed in war, but there is agency. People react to this. They react to a situation. They try to find strategies to save their lives, to even continue life projects under the conditions of a war. I admit the situation of an acute genocidal crisis. It's something different. But many cases we are talking about, and I'm sure Afghanistan is one of them, and Iraq is another one. There is agency by the people, and this doesn't mean that there is nothing to be done. But maybe if we perceive the people more in the sense that they are agents, they are people which have plans, which have conceptions. They are not only victims, and we are the saviors. If we just start to conceive them in another way, maybe there might be more efficient cooperation, because the partner we then perceive is a different one. And I think this would be very, very important.
Yeah, if I may just a short comment, the trouble with local knowledge that if you come to, as they said, if there are two Jews, there are three parties and four views. If you come, let's say, take Africa, if they come to me for local knowledge, they'll get a totally different story than when they come to somebody else and somebody else. And they don't have the, and we've spent so many years studying the continent. I mean, do you expect people who've got no background really to learn? It's very problematic.
But this shouldn't be an excuse. So you're right.
I agree. Yes, please, Sandrine. Sandrine?
We'll forget all the questions, Moti. Can we have a break to answer them?
Okay, Sandrine. Okay.
I just wanted to give an example about the
northern
Ugandan situation. As I said, I mean, there was really blind-eye diplomacy towards the northern conflict for more than 15 years. And there were a lot of local initiatives by NGOs and by religious organizations, ecumenic organizations, to try and internationalize the conflict. What I mean by internationalize is to raise awareness on the conflict, international awareness. Why? Because they thought that the unleveled dialogue between those civil society organizations and the government about the solutions to bring to that conflict would be a little bit softened, because these civil society organizations were for negotiated solutions, and the government was pushing for the last 15 years for an exclusive military solution. And when, in fact, the conflict was internationalized, that's very interesting, because you had, as I said, hundreds of new actors completely incompetent on what has happened for the last 15 years, but who also had a lot of willingness. I mean, they had a lot of goodwill and all this, but when the Juba initiatives, the Juba Pistols initiatives was created, they rushed and completely forgot to include the actors, the local actors who had worked for the last 15 years on the conflict. So they were invited to the negotiation process, but they were not at the core of the process, which means that all on this forgotten conflict and these forgotten actors were forgotten again during this internationalization process. And in fact, now now that Obama signed this this law about the LRA disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, there is really a lot of effervescence to find new solution to solve this conflict. And indeed, of course, the conflict has changed a lot. But what is interesting is that when they asked us about the solutions that they found, they said, yeah, we were thinking that this solution could be. We said, okay, that has been tried already. That has been tried. So don't be so arrogant. Just look at what has been done already.
Thank you.
Okay, so can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, Kobe, on peacekeeping, I think you and I are substantially in agreement. I think the money hasn't been put forth, the effort hasn't been put forth, and the West certainly has a lot to answer for. Point taken. So let me get to the issue where you and I probably disagree the most, and that's on the thrust of your presentation and your questions to me. Now, in some respects,
you were constrained by the fact that you were presenting an Israeli position. I understand that. But when one loads the presentation with the term positive peace, it really behooves the presenter to say what is expected of one side and what are the responsibilities of the other, especially in a conflict where the scales of power are weighted heavily against Israel. And my point is that not out of magnanimity or charity, but out of just plain self-interest, there is probably much more that Israel can do to prevent the scenario that I completely agree with you. You cannot tolerate a Hamas-like operation on the West Bank. You have my complete agreement. I've been here enough times, and I understand this. And let me just say something to you, which I don't do in conferences like this, because, but it needs to be said, perhaps. I find it difficult to look at this country purely as an academic, because my wife is Jewish and my children are Jewish. So I don't take for granted the fact that this is an important thing, the creation of the state. The debate really has to do with how one serves the best interests of the state. And so what I found where you and I would disagree is on the question of whether, after the Palestinians have achieved and done the things that you want them to do, whether in fact a discussion can be had about whether Israel has done what it should do. On the loyalty oath, I didn't mean to imply it applied to the Arabs. Rona, I was just saying that it looked to me like a sort of a cheap political trick that a powerful democratic country like Israel doesn't have to resort to. Now, what?
Please,
we don't know about loyalty.
Please.
Look, the way I think to deal with the question of loyalty to the state, like any state, Israel is entitled to expect loyalty from its citizens. But what happens is that if a person is disloyal, i.e. treacherous, harming the state, there are laws under which he or she should be prosecuted. I mean, I think that is the way to proceed. And even if the U.S. has a loyalty state, I'm not the ambassador of the United States here, sir, so it's not that I'm going to defend everything that the United States has done. As you know, I've said a number of critical things about U.S. policy, so don't put me in the position where I have to defend.
Kobe, please.
Kobe, I understand that, but I'm saying at a delicate period in the peace process, it's not a good idea. Now, let me come to your question. It sounds like a trick question. Compare the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and Hungary with the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. I sort of worry that there's a dagger waiting to attack me. But look, I supported the American intervention in Afghanistan, notwithstanding the fact that there may have been other ways to go about it, more delay, pressure on the Taliban and so on, because we were attacked. Iraq, our hands are not entirely clean. We dealt with a bloody dictator for a very long time. Whatever he was doing at the time, as I said, he was not engaged in mass atrocities. He did not have nuclear weapons. We made ourselves look like fools in the eyes of the international community. And we've created a problem of a huge magnitude that has yet to play out. So before the war, you can go and Google my op-eds if you want. It's not something I'm saying now. I thought it was a mistake. I continue to think it was a mistake, but we're stuck there. The Soviet invasion, let me just address the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, I thought it was a horrible thing to do. I'm no supporter of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. I don't like empires. Okay? I know something about empires at a personal level, so I don't like them particularly. I think that's it. Is there anyone's question that I missed?
That's okay. We don't have too much time. Frédéric, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Only two short remarks, an answer and a remark. First of all, I have to tell you that I wasn't in favor of the American and allies, 43 allies, intervention of Iraq, and especially because the goals of war the objectives of war were unserious. And according to me, from real democracies, as for example the United States, the goals of war are very important, much more fundamental than from dictatorship. And I wasn't in favor of this invasion, but I see and I know that now at least two populations that represent together the strong majority, objectively the strong majority of Iraqi citizens are living better and are more happy. It wasn't very difficult to be for them more happy than under the pressure, the terrible pressure of Saddam Hussein. I mean the Kurdish and the Shiites, sure, are now more happy. Okay, it's a good for them, a good result. It wasn't a reason to intervene. And I'm very agree with you, Teresa, when you speak about the knowledge, the terrible lack, the amazing lack of knowledge from especially the Americans in Afghanistan and much more in Iraq is terrible, because it's really not possible to pretend to bring democracy and happiness and so if you don't know the real needs and the real identities of the population that you pretend to save.
Thank you, Frederick.
I want to respond to you. I think, I don't know if maybe there was a misunderstanding, but my presentation was definitely about how to understand local populations and how to find ways to get there. And I do have a lot of criticism about this. Even here in Israel, when I see some of the international peace operations around here, they don't tend to mix with the local populations and really make the effort to know about us. But I also have to say that we don't make the effort to let them, to give them the information. So I'm saying something very broad. Of course, it's much more nuanced than this. But yes, there are huge problems in that are inherent in this deployment. And this is that soldiers are usually deployed only for 6 months. It takes 2 months to get acclimated, 2 months to be effective, and 2 months to think about going back. And countries do not usually go for more than for those 6 months. Absurdly, they sometimes even go for only 4 months, like some of the contingents in Lebanon. So there are really inherent problems in this. On the other hand, they look at it very practically. We have to do the most we can to educate soldiers and commanders and the civilians deployed on how to decipher these local cultures. On the other hand, how many of us, even here in the room, are willing to go for these conflict areas and be deployed there and live in these conditions and help these countries? So it's a very here I also want to respond to the cynicism about peace operations, because I'm in between the romantic and the practical. I mean, we always have to ask ourselves, just if we look at human nature, how much of our time do we really dedicate, most of us, to other people and to serve the interests of other people purely? I mean, or do we do it really to satisfy ourselves? So we have to look at this in a more balanced way. We have what we have. We're part of humanity, and humanity, and some countries are willing to dedicate more to other countries, and some countries are not. And this is why we have to decipher the codes and work with those codes and get the best out of each for each of these peace operations. And yes, even when we look at the possible operation in the Israeli-Palestinian interface, I think that both Israel and the Palestinians, we have to ask ourselves very hard questions of who do we want deployed here and how much they can assist and what can we do that this international presence, we can get the most out of it to assist us. And the same thing goes, and this is why the suggestions to monitor and evaluate all these NGOs. I mean, a lot of money goes around, and we talked about it. I mean, money that could be served, could serve these purposes much better if it was monitored and evaluated. And I think we have to put these mechanisms in place. It's only embryonic now, but I think definitely for what's going on here with the billions of dollars invested, to see what's going on with this money. And I think the international community, as painful as it can be to some NGOs and some governmental organizations, needs to put the money to monitor what it does. And let's see what's going on with that. I mean, if this kind of project can, this hard-earned money and these billions of dollars, I completely agree. They need to be monitored much more closely than they are now. And I think this is a serious thing that the UN, but also the other actors have to look at and do something else about this. And really, I would even say, really monitor project by project. If somebody wants to deploy into the West Bank, with all the good intentions, I think that this is something where maybe some of the actors can collaborate on and on how to create mechanisms. And this is not only in Israel, of course it's only in Africa, but Israel and Palestine, but also in Africa. So this is something to be thought about the international community, and I hope more attention will be paid for it now and in the future.
Thank you very much. And now a few personal words of conclusion. Well, for me, we've worked on it for quite a long time. On the one hand, I leave this conference more pessimist, more depressive, and more sad than I've started it. And as the cliche says, the only light I see at the end of the tunnel is of the train coming my way. But on the other hand, I think it was a most interesting conference, and we had a wonderful meeting of mind, and despite the short period, also I feel personally a meeting of hearts. It has been our center's first attempt at international collaboration. In principle, we like collaborations, but that's the first international collaboration. In one way, it was more complicated and perhaps in some senses less efficient, but it was also very enjoyable to break the boundary, the national boundary, and especially because our foreign collaborator was in the person of Astrid, which was a great pleasure to work with. Please, Astrid, some words? No? I thought you were unhappy a bit. Okay, thank you very much. And bon voyage.